and primarily he addressed madness during the Renaissance from the 14th to the 18th century. He published this work in 1964, and it ended up becoming a launching pad for postmodern thought in France. Because, in a way, he wrote a phenomenology of madness, which is an unusual thing to even conceive of, but in essence, it ended up becoming a type of phenomenology. But he presented it within a history of the concept of madness and how madness was treated over the Renaissance period. And he kind of took us through the 15th century of the wanderings of the insane, through the 16th to the 17th century of the asylums, and then through the 17th and the 18th century of the workhouses, where the insane were gathered in a collective workhouse. And then finally the late 18th century, where in 1776 Bedlam actually had exhibitions of the insane. And also late 18th century, the concept of animality as the bare essence of insanity was launched. So it takes us through a series of moments during the Renaissance period, and he associates those moments with a general identity of existential existence itself. So he takes up madness within the concept of being, and he is the individual who really, prior to Derrida, really came up with this idea of needing to deconstruct. Although Derrida would develop the term deconstruction, so we could say negate, but he came up with the idea of the necessity of negating the classical concept of reason, which had created a distortion, so much so that madness was misinterpreted and inauthentically responded to during the Renaissance. But he blamed this on the very tight association that the Renaissance period had with classical reason and the classical interpretation of logos and reason, and therefore madness was a highly negative concept, highly negative reality, and generally viewed outside the divine logos. If it was inclusive within the logos, it was only so as a just punishment. So Foucault blames classical reason for this consequence, and this is what Derrida picked up on when he developed his phenomenology of deconstruction and re-elaboration. He picked up on Foucault's concept of madness. So it is an important moment, and it's of such importance that it needs to be understood from a point of view of it being a foundational document for postmodern thought. So when we say it's a foundational document, we will look at it within the structure of postmodern thought. So basically we will look at this chronology of madness through wanderings, asylums, workhouses, and exhibitions applied to the postmodern psychological structure. And Foucault's field was psychology more than philosophy. He was more of a psychologist, and he especially had a great interest in neuropsychology. So we're going to find out later that he has a very, very unusual look at transcendence. When we get into Logos proper and we discuss his version of Logos proper, we're going to discover that he picks up on the function of neuronal axons, and neuronal axons play an important role in his phenomenology. So he doesn't dismiss the physiological. He takes up the physiological, and it plays an important role in his entire system. But we'll get into that in detail in his discussion of the empowering of the body state, because he does key in very, very precisely on the importance of articulating the disposition of the motivational body state. That's the center of his targeting of his phenomenology. As a psychologist, he wants to address that core subjective self, which of course is a postmodern position, but that is his interest, and so for him, priority goes to the disposition of the body state and how that disposition is to be articulated and understood, both in an unconscious way and in a cognitive way. And in order to understand it in a cognitive way, he's going to propose that there will be a moment of transference through a morphology, and that morphology is going to be essential. It'll occur just after we reach the hinge point of the axis threshold of pure self-consciousness. But that morphology will be necessary in order to transition with madness into cognitive work, cognitive articulation of the motivational body state. So he has a very, very important offering. It came in 1964 in France, 3 years before Derrida wrote his Grammatology in 1967. But at the same time, Derrida was also writing his essays, which became a collection of essays published about 10 years later. Even though they were written during this period, they were published by the University of Chicago Press. But one of the early essays in that collection addressed Foucault's concept of madness. And Derrida considered it important enough to put it at the forward chronology of his essays, because it is a foundational document for his system. So let's get into this, and so we can get it wrapped up within a reasonable amount of time here. And like I said, Foucault begins by mentioning the necessity of negation of the classical concept of reason, which has distorted the concept of madness. And so he says there are 8 moments of madness as a hubris-type presumption, which was the interpretation based on the false notion of logos that the classical period presented. Number 1, it was perceived, the madness was perceived as a vice, a singularity that enclosed a plurality of other vices. It was considered a folly, which replaced the singularity of vice. Then it moved on to be considered as sensuality itself, the moral stage that evolved in the 15th century. Then it evolved to being perceived as punishment. Sensuality merits punishment of madness. And but at the same time, imagination started to emerge as the first hint of a positive. Now, the 5th moment in the evolution of this concept of hubris was that of disappearance. The self established a link with that which was about to be lost through punishment, and so there was a clinging to this positive aspect of the imaginative, because imagination was not a negative madness. And that led to the next moment of the perceiving of madness as hallucination, which really was perceived as a critical interrogation of the present false morality, your Don Quixote type literature. The next moment was return, when reason when madness was to return to the reason. In post-17th century, imagination is given a distinction of a positive sense of madness as being a meaningful manifestation of truth. The Shakespearean comical character at the center of the stage in his plays, correcting all false wisdom. through his comedic presentation. And then finally evolves the idea that reason and madness should coexist in the same unity of logos, that they should not be disassociated into a duality. So Foucault is very much against this idea of a duality, of a rigidity of separating reason and madness by designating madness as purely a hubris presumption that goes through all of its moments, evolving moments. And that's pretty much, as you know from our Derrida lecture, that is exactly what Derrida borrowed from Foucault. Now, the first moment of the subjective for Foucault is the metaphor of the self on board the ship of fools. The Navy, the sailing ships, were to purge the cities of their insane and either hijack or in some other ways the insane were forcibly exiled to these sailing ships, and they were dispersed into the metaphorical waters of chaos and waters of purification. They're set off into this wandering in the ocean, and then they would search for a port, inland port that would allow them to land and disembark. And generally that meant that they would be allowed to wander the adjoining fields to a city. But if the insane tried to enter a city, the gate was locked and they were turned away. And generally they would have to reboard a ship of fools and be disembarked into the ocean of chaos and purification again. They were exiled to wandering, or they were exiled and permanently imprisoned at the threshold gate of entrance to the city of reason. So Foucault calls our first subjective moment in his phenomenology a type of preformationism that Derrida developed, because it's a ship with a cargo of madmen in search of reason. It's a self-engendering purification, a watery journey of purification, and it's a seeking of the hyperbole, or the otherness, a seeking of an other world as a place to disembark. The disembarking is the actual act of neutralizing these units of meaning in a figurative sense, but it's not a spatial disembarking per se. It's more of a realization of a coming to presence. There's no true geographical arrival in this metaphor that Foucault is borrowing. So he begins with the ship of fools and the wandering for 40 years in the wilderness of the ocean in search of a city of reason, a type of a preformationism that Derrida would take up, where the cargo of madmen are on a quest for reason. Now, as I said, they were locked out at the threshold. The trajectory is never further than the threshold to the city of reason. The later Dekunta threshold of madness stops. There is no... remember, if you remember from Derrida's work, the disjunction, the disconnection with madness occurs as the self emerges out of the Dekunta threshold and transitions into notion. That's when there is a severing away from madness. So madness is allowed its course up to the Dekunta threshold, up to and through the Dekunta threshold of the community of madmen and madwomen. And then there will be the severing away and the transition to the city of reason. Now, the metaphor or the figurative example for Foucault for the unifying figuration of the units of meaning that are neutralized in this wandering purification is the inlet river of disembarking. It's the disembarking river of figuration. It's a river with 1,000 arms of possible figurations. It's uncertain. The self forms an uncertain figuration of externality. There's no guarantee here that they will enter any city. It's the formation of a precedence to their passage. And it includes the negation of commentary. There is a negation of the multiplied false signs of hubris from classical concepts of reason, and the enjoining commentary that they offer in conjunction with their interpretation of madness. There's a negation of what Foucault calls the charmed image. The previous false charm of an image is negated. The image of madness and the image of existential existence during this period for Foucault was only an image that fascinated, but it didn't instruct. And he said that phantasm, that fascination type image needs to be negated. It's part of the overarching influence of classical reason and classical logos. And so this image that fascinates, this charmed image, needs to be negated when the self takes up a figuration of its own within a positive conception of madness, a new emerging positive of giving some authenticity to imagination and not calling all madness hubris or punishment, as the case may be. And so he brings out the figure of the mast on the ship of fools. And he says figuration takes place where the self gathers at the mast of the ship of fools, where it has been transplanted by the tree of knowledge out of the Garden of Eden. So now we're giving some authenticity to the concept of imagination within this new existential understanding of the self, and the fact that this existential understanding of the self includes a positive rendition of madness, which is simply imagination, creative imagination. It's not all hubris, it's not all presumption, it's not all divine punishment. There is a positive, creative, imaginative aspect to existential existence, and this positive, creative, imaginative aspect does have a right toward its articulations at the tree of knowledge. It plays its role at the tree of knowledge. But this is all, of course, individualistic. We're still talking about madmen and madwomen who wander, who are a part of the ever-present punishment within logos, and a transition needs to be made. For Foucault, he has a metaphor for that transition, and he calls it the 17th to the 18th century experiences of grouping the madmen and madwomen into haunted workhouses. The haunted workhouses were either ecclesiastically affiliated with a church. There were some private workhouses, but the ethic of the moral imperative of work, it was an ethics of work, and it was a designation of sin as idleness. And so the madmen and madwomen were to be healed through work, healed through productivity, and therefore they were enclosed within haunted workhouses. These workhouses that were perceived by those outside as a type of a haunted dwelling. But from an existential point of view, from a phenomenology of madness, Foucault says that this haunting corresponds to the individual haunting of the units of meaning by their imaginative otherness, by their hyperbole of transcendent immanence, and within the collective gathering in these workhouses, there's a collective haunting of the collective group of these units of meaning by this hyperbole. And so it's not always negative. There can be the positive of the imaginative. But they were perceived as the haunted workhouses. The moral imperative of work was dominant. The workhouses were to offer direction and correction to the inhabitants. It was a juridical type of communal gathering because they possessed, in a way, even though they were associated sometimes with the government or associated sometimes with the church, the government or the church always designated a governing body, and this governing body was given a type of sovereignty that many times went unchecked. So there could be many abuses and tortures and withholding of food, misappropriation of the tax funds that were received to support the workhouses. Many abuses could take place because these institutions enjoyed a type of quasi-absolute sovereignty. For Foucault, the self must pass through this moment to reach the city of reason. This transition through the haunted workhouse is essential. It is a dialogue of mutual coexisting labor, not so much speech, but it's dialogue as a metaphor of mutual coexisting labor. Hyperbole was present in the individual units of meaning, and the goal was to seek a rhythm of collective life. A rhythm of collective life, which was considered a toimasia, which in the Greek is a readiness. So you are to create a readiness for these individuals to transition to the city of reason, and that hetoimasia readiness is created by aiming toward a horizon of a rhythm of collective life within this workhouse, a rhythm of collective life. And so the progress was critically measured by the governing body. There was a communal surveillance of every inhabitant. In many cases, we should just call them inmates. In some cases, the abuses made them more like prisons instead of workhouses. And sometimes they were actually adjoined to existing prisons. So it's not, obviously, it's an ambiguous type of a transition, but it did have a goal of a rhythm of a collective life. So Foucault, after telling us that our disembarking river of figuration must now transition through the haunted workhouse of a rhythm of collective life, we are ready to transition to the first moment of the city of reason. And this, again, has a very specific figurative and metaphorical correspondence for Foucault. And he takes us to the fact that the city of reason, before the city of reason, madness remained a secret, because madness was, in essence, exiled out of the city of reason, and so there was no understanding of madness. This led to a curiosity and an interest on a part of the populace. There was an interrogation that evolved out of this, and there grew up a demand for the appearance and the exhibition of madness. So there were exhibitions of an ordering of these mad men and mad women. A performance of madness took place. Citizens could view these exhibitions for 1 penny. It was presented to the public, and it was put into an ordered type of an exhibition by the presiding attendants who were in charge of the workhouse or the asylum. And eventually the attendants faded out of the picture, and the mad men and mad women were allowed to self-present their own madness and order it in their own conceived idea of ordering. And so it became a self-actualization of the presentation of the mad men and mad women of their own natures to the community at large in the city of reason. Foucault uses this as his metaphorical or figurative example of the notion of the true, of the imaginative side of existential existence. It's the figurative or metaphorical notion of the true for the positive, imaginative, existential aspect of knowledge at the tree of knowledge. So a very important moment, this took place. There's one specific date, 1776, when Bedlam, the asylum at Bedlam, on a regular basis practiced these exhibitions, generally once a week. These exhibitions took place, and it was a fundraiser to supplement tax monies. Each citizen that wanted to view the exhibition paid 1 penny. Now from there, we have arrived at the hinge, pivot point of the access threshold of the self in our structure of phenomenology. Foucault has a metaphorical or a figurative corresponding aspect here, and that is the concept of animality. At the opposite end of this madness that has evolved to being a glorified scandal presented to the public, in opposition to this is the concept of animality. So, glorified scandal versus animality. Now, animality is a madness reduced to no relation except to itself. It was considered rationalistically by the attendants and the governing body as the kindness of nature to return these selves to their animal states. And so it was rationalized away as a kindness of nature, a restoration to nature. The madmen and madwomen existed without any personal content whatsoever. And generally, I mean, as far as what actually took place, generally the individuals that were exiled into this condition of animality were generally stripped naked with no cover or protection from the elements. They were given straw as far as their only surrounding, and they were caged. In many instances, they were chained to walls or chained to bars, and they were completely treated like animals. And then they were elevated because the attendants said, look how they can adapt to freezing temperatures in this animal state without any protection. And so they said they're being restored to nature. So they this cruelty was rationalized, and this torture and animalistic treatment continued during the late 18th century. So they either were humiliated in their exhibitions, or they were treated worse than animals, and had this imposed concept of animality put on them, and they were put away in dungeons, in cages, and some were actually shackled for years. I mean, many, many years. Extreme torture, extreme torture. And entirely sanctioned by church and state. So there was a huge collective guilt that should have been incurred, but instead they rationalized away any guilt and said this was a restoration to nature or a just punishment. So this horrible moment, this horrible transition point, Foucault calls the concept of animality, and he says this existential self stripped to nothing is the pivot point. Existential self stripped to absolutely nothing, no name, no residence, is the pivot point of any phenomenology. So he takes up the concept of animality as his hinge pivot point. And that is basically Foucault's presentation of the history of madness. I mean, he takes us in the Renaissance from the wanderings through the asylums and their torture to the workhouses of that goal of a rhythm of collective living to prepare them for the city of reason. And then the humility of exhibitions and the cruelty of animality. That is what Foucault concentrates on. We're going to go about a few more minutes here, though, because we want to cover the transition point. I mean, that truly is about as far as Foucault wants to go in his discussion of madness, because he wants to emphasize the non-cognitive side of phenomenology, but he gives some attention to the cognitive side. But he says in order to transition to cognition, we must pass through a morphology, and this metamorphosis is a redefinition of the concept of madness. And he says this occurs by taking up the critique of the madness of the cross, which is basically God is revealed in the meandering of the madness of men. Scandal of the cross becomes the highest point of wisdom. Scandal recovers its power of revelation as the madness of the cross is taken up within divinity itself. So the Christ event was madness to the Gentiles. Madness equals the lower limit of human truth. And madness is merely the depth of finitude being taken up by the Christ event. And so, in all essence, the Christ event transitions madness into that which gets a positive rendition and is included within the eschatological horizon of the doxologos of the movement of the divinity of God itself. And so we're going to take a look at Foucault's conception of logos proper, and then we'll wrap things up, because this is the key to everything he's going to do on the cognitive side. Logos for Foucault is a type of preformationism where totality is encased within the seed of the traces of otherness themselves. It takes up three possible moments. Number one, the psychic organic pulsation. It has three steps. First is passion. The external object affects the subject by creating subjective passion. And then there's dispersed imprinting. Passion disperses the animal spirits within the self that target and imprint the bodily members. Then there's a concentrated inscribing. The somatic bodily imprinting is concentrated into an image that is a two-post inscription in the self's psyche. That's his view of logos. Logos is this subjective pulsation. That's a very postmodern concept. Logos as subjective pulsation. But take a look at part two here, the delirium of convulsions. This is where he offers something really unique. Pulsation ends up enlisting other forces through the neurophysiology of collateral axons. In neural psychology, your primary axon is your hard-lined primary axon of communication out of the neuron that will target the synaptic cleft areas of the receptors on other neurons to develop a neuron chain. But this primary axon can have collateral axons that will branch off and form sometimes contingent associations that maybe we aren't quite so directed with in our consciousness. And Foucault says that this aspect of the collateral axons creates a collateral form of delirium, and he equates this with an anarchy of transcendence. He calls it the anarchy of transcendence that the self can never fully contain. And that's kind of an interesting idea, because he says that, in his opinion, it kind of creates a kind of a fearful type of a feeling within the self that is separate from the other traces that have been stored in the psyche. So it's this idea, this lingering ancient idea of the fear of God is kind of picked up by Foucault. That's kind of strange to me, but it's interesting that he should do so. But he kind of picks up this tangential idea of the fear of God through the collateral axons over which we do not have control, yet pick up associations that kind of trouble our imprinted traces in the psyche. They kind of become a little of a what he calls an influential anarchy, a kind of an anarchy of transcendence that associates itself with our three-part psychic pulsation. So please understand this is unique to Foucault, but he ends up with a logos of psychic pulsation accompanied by an anarchy of axonal transcendence. And that puts us at about, 35 minutes, so we ran about 5 minutes over.